The Youth Synod wraps up this week at the Vatican. What will be in the final document? Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray, the papal posse, are here with analysis. And since the Pennsylvania grand jury report in August, there are now 15 open investigations of clergy sex abuse throughout the U.S., and the feds are getting involved. Illinois Supreme Court Justice and former National Review Board member Anne Burke is here with her insights. And finally, we'll get story-entered with New York Times best-selling author Markus Zusak and his new book, Bridge of Clay. The World Over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, Justice Anne Burke, and Markus Zusak are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. I'll be live tweeting throughout. Now, the Youth Synod is wrapping up in Rome as we await the final document. What can we expect? Joining me now to discuss this and more from Rome is the editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, and from Manhattan, canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray, the papal posse, all together again. Gentlemen, I want to start with something that Cardinal Tagle of the Philippines said the other day at a press conference. He was talking about that term LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, being included in the final document. Listen to what he said.
The approach of the church to the community, the people, the so-called LGBT, regarding sexual orientation, etc., was present, many times raised. And the call for the church as a welcoming church, as a church that regards the humanity of everyone, is always present. I should say my hunch is that it will be there.
What is the significance of having this terminology, LGBTQ, included in the document itself? Robert Royal.
Well, first of all, I don't believe that that term is going to be in the final document. From everything that I'm hearing, and especially today, it looks like the Africans have made it clear that they absolutely will not accept that terminology. In fact, an African bishop said today if he took a document back home to his diocese in Cameroon with the term LGBT in it, 99% of the people who would be there to read it wouldn't even know what it was about, what it meant. So I think what Cardinal Tagle was trying to do was to kind of split the difference, to say that in one way, that what he actually said later on in that same press briefing was, if the words are not there, then at least the subject and the concern will be in some way present. I don't think that that's going to satisfy the gay activists and the lobbyists who are even here in Rome in the Sala Stampa. But it looks to me like that explicit language, LGBTQ, et cetera, will not appear in the final document.
Father Murray, what do you make of this? What's the end game here? And what do you worry we're focusing so much on this? The media attention seems to be exclusively focused on this LGBT question.
It is a terrible problem for the church, Raymond, precisely because some of the leadership is pushing the line that Father James Martin has been pushing in his books and speeches, which is that God made you this way. And the assertions made, God made me a homosexual, God made me a bisexual, God made me a transgender person. And this is not true. The church has what we call Christian anthropology. It's understanding of God's creation and then the vocation to which we're called, to the life of grace. It does not include committing acts of sodomy. It does not include saying that God made me a male, but I really am a female, and therefore I'm a female. And it does not include people having sex with people of both sexes and claiming this is their divine vocation. It's a real problem because this is the agenda of the world. This is not Christian revelation. It's certainly not the teaching of the church. And one thing that bothers me always, people bring up, well, if you say these hard truths, you're offending people. And my answer to that is, when you say the truth, you can help someone be set free. The experience of the apostolate courage in the United States is when you tell the truth with love, but nonetheless a truth that jars, people have an opportunity to respond with exactly a conversion, not a submission to the categories of the world. So I'm glad that Bob says he doesn't think it's going to be in the final document, because it shouldn't be in the final document.
I want to play you something. Cardinal Blaise Cupich ran a small English language group, to discuss many issues, but homosexuality also came up this past weekend. Listen.
I was asked the question, what is the final document going to have to say to people who are homosexual, who have same-sex attraction, who have this aspect of their life? And my answer was, I think the whole document is something to say to everybody. So we wanted to make sure that people were included and felt included by whatever we had to say.
Now, Robert, you wrote a recent piece on this, and that the Catechism is quite clear on this issue, and that needs to be explored more.
Yeah, I think, though, that they hope to exploit. There's a phrase in the section of the Catechism about people who are same-sex attracted. It makes it clear that they are to be respected because they are human beings made in the image and likeness of God, but that we are also to respect the passage in Genesis right near where that is affirmed in the first pages of the Bible, that male and female he created them, and that there is no Catholic path forward for the acceptance of homosexual activity as such. However, I think that there's a way that they hope that this is going to soften the opposition. And in a way, even just debating this, in a way, gives the impression to lots of young people that, well, this question is up for grabs in the Catholic Church. At some future point, the bishops might make a different decision. And I think this is a general problem that is emerging, because the Pope is kind of made it clear that he would like to see a series of regular synods like this that debate substantive questions and then will become part of the ordinary magisterium. And once you start to do that, almost any question can be brought up. So it's very possible that we won't ever feel again that there are settled teachings. So there's a thin edge of the wedge here. But I want to say, on the contrary side, I wrote in that same article that I'm tired of talking about this subject about LGBT, and even Cardinal Marx in Germany, who's one of the most progressive bishops in the church, and is the leader of a kind of a wing in Germany to talk about these issues. Even he said today that he's tired of talking about it, that this isn't the center of Christ's teaching, that there are many other things that are part of the Catholic faith that are much more wide open and wide-ranging and lead us out of ourselves into the whole world and then into the afterlife.
But this is part of the conversation, if you will. It's not just the people in that hall. It ends up being the media at large, activists, etc. And it seems, as the Family Synod became about communion for divorced and remarried Catholics and their new spouses or girlfriends or boyfriends, this is turning into a youth synod that should be about reaching and evangelizing the youth. It's really become about gay rights. One of the proposals that emerged from this small English language group of Cardinal Cupich's was this: we propose a separate section for this issue of homosexuality, and that the main objective of this be pastoral accompaniment of these people, which follows the lines of the relevant sections of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Father Jerry, that references what Robert was talking about a little while ago, that they're going to, quote the Catechism, where gay people should not be discriminated against, should be welcomed, and try to expand that a bit. Consider that, and relate it, if you will, to what we saw with Amoris Laetitia and the Family Synod.
Yes, the title of this synod, Raymond, is about youth, faith, and vocation. We've heard very little about either of the faith or vocation aspects. Most of the conversation has been centered around young people who don't understand or accept Catholic teaching, and how can we accommodate the church so that they'll be somehow happy or feel part of the church. I get very upset when people say you have to be inclusive. That's meant to cut off discussion. Inclusivity in the mind of the gay rights activists is agree with what we say, grant a same-sex marriage, don't criticize sodomy, and then start believing that there really are transgender and bisexual people made by God to commit those acts. No, this is propaganda effort. The teaching of the church is beautiful, it's rich, it teaches that God made male and female for the complementarity so that new life and love can be brought into the world. This has nothing to do with the satisfaction of disordered desires, and respect for someone who has a disordered desire is to tell them, look, your desire is bad, don't act on it. That's the true accompaniment. To accompany someone by saying, look, I know you feel bad because you can't get married to your, two boyfriends can't get married in church. We're working on changing that. That's not accompaniment. That's what we would call destruction and subversion.
I want to throw something to you here. At a press conference on Tuesday, Bishop Tagle, again, Cardinal Tagle, had this to say about his experience at the Synod. I want you both to react.
The young people were doing a lot for us. They were teaching us. It is not a synod that pretends to provide all solutions and all answers, clear solutions and clear answers. For life is not clear. And the life of the young people now is really not clear.
Bob, I'll start with you. Why have a synod and a final document if there's no clarity in it?
Well, you put your finger on the main point. Look, he's saying that the modern world is complicated, and we know that young people do have a number of choices in front of them that perhaps didn't exist even 10 or 15 years ago, and so they have a difficulty to negotiate this modern world that they're in. But one of the interesting things that also has been taking place at the Synod, and I think that the secular media in a way have been overemphasizing the gay discussion, because there are other things going on. There are conversations about how young people want to be accompanied in the sense of being provided with the rich tradition that the church has, that they need older people, experienced people, experts in theology and philosophy and moral theology to guide them along, to help form them so that they will be full Christians. Now, just yesterday, a book was issued by the Vatican about the wisdom of older people. And in it, the Pope, who's in conversation with a number of people, older and younger, and he writes a couple essays himself, talks about the wisdom of grandparents and recommends that young people pay attention to the wisdom of grandparents. Well, that's great, but how do we get them to listen to grandparents in the first place? Most of the young people who are here are, of course, already intensely engaged with the church. So they're a different cohort than young people as a whole. But to try to convert young people as a whole because they're out in this complicated world, I think we have to establish first a very strong base among the people who are interested already in the church and know that they're lacking something that other people can provide them who are older.
Father Jerry, Bob mentioned this book. There was a book launch that Father Antonio Spadaro, who is part of this book release, it's called Sharing Wisdom, and it was an event running side by side with the Youth Synod. So he said the project is a part of the work of the Synod. And here's what he had to say. He said, Holy Father, at the Synod, the young people showed us the future. Well, today we learn that we must build an alliance between the dreams of the elderly and the future of the young. But Father, the predicate of this whole Synod, and we've been hearing it from these cardinals for weeks now, is that the young are teaching us. I don't hear much in the other way of the cardinals and the church saying, here's the truth, here's what we've learned through 2,000 years, and what you might need for the rest of your little journey.
Very good observation, Raymond. I go back to what our Lord said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nothing could be clearer. And then the teaching that he gave to the apostles over the course of his public ministry, that was not obscure. It was quite clear. The Catechism of the Catholic Church is a fleshing out and an exposition of both the natural law and divine revelation. It's quite clear. People want clarity. St. John Paul II issued the Catechism of the Catholic Church precisely because doctrinal confusion, which was created by people who were unhappy with Catholic doctrine, becomes a means to kind of overthrow the church, overthrow the faith. Cardinal Sarah has written 2 books already in which he is, in an interview form, basically said, the people of today are no different than the people of any other time. They want 2 things. They want to be in love and communion with God, and they want to know what God expects of them, the truth. So truth and love, they're very accessible. Just turn to Christ. We don't need to conduct, a survey of 500,000 people to find out, well, what are you really interested in life? We're not selling a product. This isn't, Coke versus Pepsi. We have to propose Jesus Christ. And if there's one thing I would say, the headlines of the Synod, of course, reflect the secular media, but there hasn't been enough emphasis on getting young people back into the sacramental life of the church and doctrinal formation. That's, the African church is strong precisely because the sacraments and the teaching of the church are loved and appreciated.
Before we leave this discussion of the Youth Synod, gentlemen, I have to share this with you. This is Bishop Andrew Fuwanya, and he's from Cameroon, and he spoke very movingly at a press conference about what's working in Africa and what he believes this Youth Synod should be about. Watch.
People ask me, why are your churches full? Because our traditional values still equate the values in the church. We hand over the tradition of to our young people undiluted and uncontaminated. And that is why we think that in the Synod, we have to be very clear to our young people. While we are listening to them, we should also get the youth to listen to the elders. And that the church is talking to the youth in unambiguous language.
Father Jerry, I'll let you react first and then to Bob.
Well, his words ring true to me. I was pastor of a parish here in Manhattan that served French-speaking Catholics for 14 years, and the majority of my parishioners were new immigrants from French-speaking Africa. And believe me, if you read the catechism and explained it, there were no objections. There was, admitting that this teaching is tough, but one thing we have to remember, what they're dealing with in there is a combination of secularism being imposed by the UN and other organizations, and then we also have the problem of paganism and violence connected with superstition. They understand that the clarity of Catholic teaching is the only liberation that is available to them from the despair of secularism and paganism. So his words are beautiful, and of course, we don't care what the press says. Every Catholic priest and bishop should keep that in mind. We're not trying to create headlines. We're trying to get souls to know Christ. So to speak the truth, whether the media likes it or not, we have to speak the truth.
Bob, what has been the impact of the media massage, if you will, on this? The pressure, obviously, the LGBT thing has been very pronounced from the press, and it seems it's leaked into the Synod and maybe even shifted the Synod a bit in the same way the Family Synod was taken over. And what might we expect from a final document?
Well, I actually have a slightly different take on that. I think that the Synod started out with a stronger desire on the part of some of the organizers to push the LGBT themes. And as time went on, I think they got quite a bit of pushback, at least in the press briefings, in the conversations that I've had with people. And you see it that even people like Cardinal Marx and some others who have been strong public supporters of gay rights, gay equality, and some of the lobbyists come out and try to get them to say things. They're very, very wary about stating baldly, I think, what they really believe, and that is that they would like to see the church change in the direction of accepting these things. One of the beautiful things about this African Bishop Joseph is that he's very perceptive, too. He's a very charming personality. And one of the things he said is, look, if we speak to young people and we begin to betray a hint that we're not ourselves convinced of the truth of the faith, they notice it. And they don't get greater confidence. They actually start to be more skeptical if they see that we don't really believe. So this was a challenge to the people who might be intimidated a bit by the way that the media and the lobbying groups have been coming at them. And I think that has happened in a number of different places. It obviously hasn't stopped the discussion. It hasn't just removed that discussion from, I think, what we're even going to see in the final document. But it's been surprising to me how much pushback there has been by some very good bishops, some very clear thinkers that the church has got to have confidence and have something to offer people. Otherwise, they will just continue along with a culture that we know is disastrous.
Very quickly, I want to go to talk of the Archbishop Vigano's third letter. Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano dropping a third statement on the church, dispelling and answering back some of the charges that Cardinal Ouellet in the last week, who's a Vatican cardinal, threw toward him. And in that third letter, he states again that there is a conspiracy of silence that has wrought and continues to wreak great harm in the church. He points out two silences. The first regards victims of sexual abuse. He writes this: "It is dismaying that amid all the scandals and indignation, so little thought could be given to those damaged by the sexual predations of those commissioned as ministers of the gospel. It is not a matter of how church historians may evaluate this or that papacy. This is about souls. Many souls have been and are now imperiled of their eternal salvation." Why so little attention to this story in the last few weeks? I'll get you to react, Father Jerry.
Well, you know, the Synod and other things have come up, but I think Archbishop Vigano, responding to Cardinal Willett, has said very eloquently what's at stake here. We have a serious problem in the United States with negligence by bishops concerning priests who committed sexual abuse. We have the problem of now ex-Cardinal McCarrick. Cardinal McCarrick, when he was back in June, still cardinal, he was accused and reliably accused, according to the Holy See, of having abused an altar boy in St. Patrick's Cathedral. We're now at the end of October. Why hasn't Cardinal McCarrick's trial happened? Why hasn't he been removed from the priesthood? He wasn't simply negligent about what other people did. He's the one causing the harm. He was then accused by a second person of having abused him since he was 11 years old. The Holy See's reaction cannot be slow and simply issuing apologies. Victims have been coming forward based on the Pennsylvania matter. Now other probes are happening. The Holy See has to act, and that must include him. We talked about this a few months ago. There should be a tribunal set up so that the church investigates her own crimes and doesn't leave it up to the secular authorities to do it. It's a mess. It needs to be cleaned up. And I'm glad the Pope's doing it in Chile. He just removed 2 bishops who committed sexual abuse. Let's start doing it here.
Bob, why hasn't there been more discussion of the sex abuse crisis when you're dealing with young people, and that's apparently anybody 35 and younger? It would seem the elephant in the room and speak right to the church's moral credibility. Why haven't these issues been discussed at any length in this Youth Synod?
Well, they have. They probably haven't been in the media very much, especially back in the United States. But we hear over and over again here in the various meetings involved regarding the Synod that this has been a subject that has come up. In fact, just today, somebody suggested that sex abuse should be on the very first page, perhaps even in the very first paragraph, and the bishops kind of went back and forth on this, whether that was a good idea or not. But I agree with Father very much. I think that the Vatican listens too much to the kind of media that we have here in Europe and primarily in Italy, which doesn't seem to be as outraged about priestly abuse as we tend to be in the United States. They still don't get. And I think that this is a very big problem. They don't understand that the United States is a different kind of culture, that for us, this is almost a defining moment for the Church and for this papacy. And that, as Father rightly says, you cannot just allow secular authorities to pursue people who committed crimes and think that that solves the problem. The Church itself has to show itself capable of recognizing and acting, not just on people who are abusers, but also on bishops, who whether they abused themselves or whether they covered up or they looked the other way. This is a serious problem defining whether the Church is going to have moral credibility. And one of the reasons why it's come up again and again with the young people is they tell the bishops, and this is one way that they are teaching the bishops something, they tell them that unless this issue is dealt with openly and effectively, it's going to damage your credibility with our age cohort.
I want to share with you Archbishop Vigano's second silence. He's calling it the second silence in the Church. He writes, "This very grave crisis cannot be properly addressed and resolved unless and until we call things by their true names. This is a crisis due to the scourge of homosexuality, in its agents, in its motives, in its resistance to reform. It is no exaggeration to say that homosexuality has become a plague in the clergy, and it can only be eradicated with spiritual weapons. It is an enormous hypocrisy to condemn the abuse, claim to weep for the victims, and yet refuse to denounce the root cause of so much sexual abuse, homosexuality. Father Jerry, has that message been received in Rome, or is it being dismissed sort of as a political attempt to take down the Pope and the whole Vigano affair wrapped in the same boat?
Well, I will say the Pope in his letter to the Chilean hierarchy did identify the problem of homosexual priests in seminaries preying on seminarians. So the Pope is aware. He knows that in the situation in Chile, this has been a homosexual crisis, and he's taking action there. Look, the problem here gets down to this. People are overly sympathetic to the point of view of, say, if someone has a homosexual desire and acts on it, we shouldn't get too upset about it. We should just basically say, well, don't do it anymore, and then that's all. And the way the Church has traditionally taught this is, yeah, we feel sorry for people who have disordered affections, but we do not entrust them with authority over other people. We don't put them in situations where they're going to, repeat offense. And, everyone's saying, well, we have to normalize homosexuality in the life of the Church. That's on the other side, I would say. And our answer is, look, normality is what we want to have. We want to help people have a homosexual problem in their life, but we can't just pretend it's not at the root of why all of these victims have been victimized over the years, primarily teenage boys by male clerics. This is a problem.
Bob, the Pope has yet to answer, really, any of these charges that Vigano raises. Can he continue to remain silent? And will he stonewall, do you think, as he did with the dubia, those 5 questions presented by his cardinals? Can he do that?
Well, he can, obviously, but there's going to be a damage to him, and there's going to be a damage to the Church, and that's going to be a price that's going to have to be paid for not answering something that patently has to be responded to. I think, in a way, that the Willette letter it was concocted to be a kind of a response to Archbishop Vigano. But it's very clear that no one has really stepped forward and rebutted the charges that he makes. They talk about the way he went about it, or, did the Pope, this or that? Was it a sanction? Was it a private letter? These are all secondary issues. The main factor is here that we know that people in the Vatican, going back 15, 20 years, knew very well that McCarrick was damaged goods. And yet somehow he moved up the food chain and became Cardinal Archbishop of Washington. When he retired and those offenses that he had committed earlier could be kind of quietly used to keep him in check, he shouldn't appear in public, shouldn't have public liturgies, he receives a letter from Pope Benedict XVI telling him he should live a life of prayer and penitence. But somehow, when Francis is elected, he comes back from the dead. These things cannot be ignored. They can be ignored, but there's a price to pay for this.
Right.
And enough of this is now known that has not been refuted. There's nothing in the Willette letter that changes those basic facts. This may very well be a defining moment for the papacy, whatever else Pope Francis does.
Wow. Yeah, and he wasn't alone. McCarrick was not the only cardinal or bishop who rose in the ranks and had a record of this sort of thing, and people knew of it. This is just the one instance that Vigano is pointing out where he informed the Pope in this case and other officials at the Vatican, and literally nothing was done. There are reports that the Vatican is laying the groundwork to open formal debate on opening priesthood to married men in parts of the world where clergy is scarce. We already have priests in the Eastern Rite, in the Ordinariate, that are married, men who come over from Anglicanism. Where do you think this is going, Father Jerry, or is this just a distraction to get people to stop talking about the Vigano letter, sex abuse, and all the rest?
Well, it may be both. It may be a distraction, but also a substantive move that the Holy Father is interested in. The Synod on Amazonia will be coming up in 2019, was going to include a discussion of this, because we know that some of the bishops involved have been talking about it. And all I can say is this would be a world-class disaster for the Catholic Church. It's not intrinsically impossible to have married priests. We do have it. But the glory of the Latin Church is that it requires of her priests that they become living icons of Christ. in the way they live without being married. Christ was not married. The priest who represents Christ is not married in the Latin Church for a very important reason. We are totally given over to that spousal relationship with the Church, that we stand in the place of Christ in a sacramental role and a teaching role, and then through the grace of Christ are able to influence people to give their lives to God as married people, as religious, whatever it is. The married clergy is, the Ukrainians have it, the Lebanese, the Episcopalians here in the U.S., but it is not the lived experience of Christianity, and it is not the most perfect representation possible of Christ's life in the world. So I'm very fearful of this, because we should not turn the Catholic Church into a debating club in which everything that people are unhappy with, they feel the right to bring up. The celibacy of clergy was assaulted after the Second Vatican Council, and Pope Paul VI issued an encyclical on the matter stating, no, celibacy is connatural with the priesthood. It's a good thing. It needs to be upheld. The other pontiffs after that, the same thing. This would be a terrible, terrible mistake, and I think most lay people would not be happy with it.
Bob, what Father just mentioned, this notion of a debating club that these synods might indeed turn into, or perhaps are already, does that concern you? That will open up every settled matter and teaching in the Church?
Yeah, well, I mentioned earlier, I think the very form that this is starting to take on can be abused, and it can be abused in a very bad way. Just today, again, the question of women in the Church and the possibility of deaconesses came up. And as we know, this has been studied and rejected multiple times. But once you start to have sort of a permanent body that's going to meet every now and then, I mean, we had marriage, and now marriage seems to be more confused. We have young people, and we don't have anything clear, although the young people themselves are asking for clarity and for guidance and for formation and accompaniment. Now, if we turn on to married priesthood and perhaps the role of women in the Church, this is going to become an ongoing debating society, when one of the important characteristics of the Church, and I think especially important for young people in the very fact that it's so complicated for them in the modern world, is the Church has some very clear ideas about the truth, about the way God wants us to live, who we are, what our relationship should be with one another and with God. And that is a saving message even in this world. It gives people a confidence that there's something that they can hold on to in the midst of all the confusion and evil, frankly, that exists in the world as well. So this form of debating a number of things, it may not be everything, but it's enough that it starts to give people the impression. I remember just enough of the post-Vatican II period to know that in those days, people were assuming everything was up for grabs or everything had been changed. There's a real danger that this can happen. And it was just said at one of the briefings this week that the Church needs to change. It needs to become something different. Yeah. And it was put in very broad terms, as if it's obvious that what we have is inadequate. I think that this is a dangerous moment, and that we need to proceed very, very carefully so that we don't give the impression that we're just like a political body, that what exists and is true today can be changed tomorrow, and there is no truth to guide us through our lives and into our deaths.
Father Jerry Murray, before I let you go, Bishop Martin Holley, who was the ordinary in Memphis, Tennessee, has been relieved of his duties by the Pope. This happened on Wednesday. It seems there was some confusion or upsetment about the way he reassigned clergy in that diocese. Any insight on this removal?
Yes, there was an uproar because Bishop Holley, in one fell swoop, transferred, I think, more than half of the pastors in the diocese, just moved them around. There was dissatisfaction expressed to the Holy See, and the Holy Father sent Archbishop Wilton Gregory and Archbishop Bernard Hebda to do an apostolic investigation. Obviously, the results of that were that the pastoral imprudence of the bishop was such that he had to leave the diocese. So it's a very regrettable moment, because you hate to see anybody removed who's a sitting bishop. But on the other hand, part of the Holy Father's charge is to be the shepherd of the shepherds. So if a shepherd is not doing a good job, then the Holy Father will bring in someone else. And we pray for peace in that diocese, because this has been very upsetting to the clergy and the laity.
Very good. We will leave it there. Papal Posse, thank you for being with us. Robert Royal's Synod reports and commentary, as well as Father Gerald Murray's commentary, can always be found at thecatholicthing.org. Two more attorneys general are turning their sights on the sex abuse crisis in the church. Karl Racine, the Attorney General for Washington, D.C., announced this week that his office will open an investigation into the Archdiocese of Washington. The Archdiocese has been shaken recently by a pair of high-profile abuse scandals that led to the resignation of former D.C. Archbishop Theodore McCarrick and the recent resignation of Cardinal Donald Wuerl. The D.C. Attorney General does not handle criminal felonies, however. It can enforce Washington's laws governing nonprofit organizations. Meanwhile, Virginia Attorney General Mark Herring said Wednesday that his office is looking into whether abuse took place in the Commonwealth and whether any church officials may have covered up or abetted any such crimes. The Attorney General has set up a hotline and an online page for victims to report abuse. Here with analysis and her insights on these investigations of sex abuse by clergy springing up all over the country, I'm joined in studio by Illinois Supreme Court Justice and a former member of the U.S. Bishops' National Review Board, Anne Burke. Judge,
Hello,
great to
Raymond.
see you.
Thank
you for being here.
Thank you.
Now, we are the tally is up to 15 states across the country now probing, and the feds are getting involved. What does this mean? And are you still supportive of these secular authorities coming in and opening up the files, doing their investigations?
Well, I am supportive of the secular agencies coming in and looking at the files, because I think what we see here is a pattern of perhaps all the files were not given to us, which we already know. 15 years ago, they were secret files. And I understand that even Buffalo is being looked at now for files that they might not have turned over or even posted about different priests that they had known were abusing and didn't post their names properly or when they should have. So they're still out there.
Now, federal subpoenas have been issued in certain localities, including Pennsylvania. What does federal scrutiny mean as opposed to the state AG looking into this? How difficult and tense is this going to get for these dioceses?
Well, I think what it signals is that it's not going to be a particular decision by a particular state's attorney or district attorney, which covers a small geographic area. What I think it signals is that it's an enterprise of some sort. It's something that is happening throughout the United States, and they're looking at all the bishops, they're looking at all the cardinals and all the dioceses and eparchies in the United States who agreed under the charter 15 years ago to make sure that there was going to be transparency in their going through any accusations, new accusations, but also posting those offenders that they already knew about.
So if a RICO statute is invoked, the racketeering statute, which was originally created for the mob, if that is invoked here, the charter could be the glue that ties the bishops together in their conference as well.
It appears that could be a civil RICO kind of a lawsuit. I'm not sure what's in the minds of the federal government doing this, but it seems clear that it's like a drip of a faucet. It's dripping, and the only way you can do it is to make sure that that every diocese is disclosing their files openly.
You and Bob Bennett, Leon Panetta, other members of that original National Review Board went to the bishops and said, look, we're willing to be an independent investigatory task force, if you will, when this first broke. If they had taken you up on the offer, do you think they'd be where they are today?
I think we'd be looking at it differently, absolutely. I think I know what we would have recommended, and that is talk to every bishop and every cardinal and say, you post everything right now. You're confidential, you're restricted, or secret files, whatever you want to call it, in addition to all the accusations on credible offenders since 2015, 2004, I should say.
The bishops are waiting till after their November assembly to address this crisis. In your opinion, is that a good idea or is that too late?
I think it's too late for the Catholic lay people. I've talked to so many people and people across the country who are telling their priests, what are we to do? What are we supposed to do? Should we be giving to the church? Should we be giving? Should we be going to church? Should our children be going to Catholic schools? I don't think waiting to inform the Catholics in the United States about what needs to be done by the bishops. We need leadership. We don't have any leadership. It's like, well, now what do? We're waiting for another diocese to be subpoenaed?
Yeah.
And is it going to be mine?
No, you see the drip, drip, drip. And this is, I think it rattles the laity, but the bishops also are caught flat-footed on this. They're not attorneys. They don't know how to deal with this stuff. And much of it happened in the past. Their predecessors were the people involved. The question is, and it's been the question you and I have discussed before, what do they know now? How many predators are in the system now? And who knew about it? Those are the people we need out. And I still don't understand, even with the federal involvement, how do you get to that place? How do you figure that out?
Well, it's not that hard, Raymond. If you know who the predators were 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and a bishop transferred that person to another diocese, that's one of them. That's who's doing it. And even if somebody came in later, that bishop should know his priest's files, and they should know where they were sent to. And and could find out where that priest is today, if it hasn't been posted already.
Well, there's also the question of family lineage here. You know, you trace your family tree. If you've got a bishop like McCarrick, who's a known malefactor, and there are many others we could name, who did he ordain? Who did he move up the chain? Where are they now? I think that someone's got to do that kind of deep investigation, and it seems to me the church has to authorize that. The federal government's not going to be able to do that.
No, but the federal government can get the records, and the records would disclose. For instance, if there was a bishop who has a priest that he knows about, is an offender, and he went to the seminary with him, they're friends. They're not going. He's not going to send them to the lay review board or that priest. So I mean, it's not that hard. That information is not that hard. John Jay did it. They should be able to do it again.
Well, and with the discovery powers of the federal government, even the state government,
yes,
they can do a lot
Civil
more
authorities.
than lay people.
Civil authorities need to, because that's who we're going to trust. We're not going to trust the bishops doing it again.
Now, you wanted the bishops to authorize an independent lay group to go in and investigate, but you don't look well upon Cardinal Dolan, who appointed his own special investigator. He brought in a former judge, and he said, you go through the records, you look at everything. What's wrong with having a lay person rifling through the files, gaining familiarity, so they become the point of contact with these federal and local investigators?
Well, if they became a point of contact with the federal investigators or civil authorities, that's a different story. Then that person who Dolan might have appointed is not subject to Dolan. That's the position I take. Whoever the bishops or cardinals appoint cannot be beholden to their appointers. It has to be to provide the information to the civil authorities. That's the only way lay people are going to actually start to begin to trust again. We have to start trusting our leadership. And we're not going to be able to do it if whoever they appoint reports to them. It's not going to work.
You recently resigned from the Order of Malta, the esteemed society in the church. Why?
I received a letter that everybody in Malta received in the United States, that the sex abuse crisis is something we shouldn't be talking about. We should be praying for it. I feel that Malta should be standing up and demanding. We're an organization that's international, that should be saying to the Pope, listen, your pontiff, please do something for all of us in the world on the sex crisis. It's ruining our church. It's tearing us apart.
Did the USCCB ever get back to you aside from that letter?
They did last week. I got a letter from DiNardo that pretty much says thank you. We received a lot of help, offers of help from a lot of lay people around the country. Thank you very much.
That was it?
That's it.
Well, maybe he'll call on you in the days to come. Justice Anne Burke, thank you for being here. Pleasure to see you. And now let's get story-oriented. He's the New York Times best-selling author of The Book Thief, which was just named America's 14th favorite novel by PBS viewers in their Great American Read. I sat down with him recently here in Washington to talk about storytelling and his newest epic, only 13 years in the making, Bridge of Clay. Here's my exclusive interview with Markus Zusak. So Markus, tell me, Bridge of Clay, 13 years to write this book. Why did it take so long this time?
Well, I say this with a smile on my face, but there was a fair bit of failure right from the beginning. And I think for a long time, I'd always thought of this book as being my best idea. I thought of it when I was 20 years old, which is more than 2 decades ago. And I think when you think of something as your best idea, you've already put pressure on yourself. And so I think I just got a bit over-focused on making every single thing perfect as I was writing it.
Yeah.
And I think you can easily lose sight of the fact that it only has to be the best it can be when it's going to the printer.
Right.
And you just have to just get your hands dirty and hope for the best for a long time as well.
What was it about this story that made it so elusive? I mean, we all have our kind of pet ideas that you're almost afraid to approach because they occupy such a piece of your heart in some ways. What was it about this one that made it so hard to get on paper?
I think it was pretty much everything. I mean, firstly, the idea, it's about a character who wants to make something perfect. Then I decided he could have a brother and a sister. That was in the original incarnation of the story was 20 years ago, and I thought, well, that didn't work. And I ended up with 5 brothers in a family, and then I wanted to go into the backstory of their parents as well. And so I just thought, because who we are actually starts long before we're born. And so I wanted to write a character who's building his whole life into this bridge he's building. And I love the idea that novels are complete worlds. And so it's a matter of figuring out how many countries you want to have on the map. And I think maybe I put a lot of work into the planning, and sometimes you just don't know quite when to stop. But it was, my favourite moments talking about this book were when people would say to me, if you're having so much trouble with this book, just write one of your other ideas. And I'd say, I haven't got any other ideas.
This is it.
This is it. But now I realise I did have other ideas, but they were all going into this book. It was very much a sense of all or nothing. For a long time, it was nothing.
Yeah. Well, this is about Clay Dunbar, who wants to build a bridge over a river before it floods. And I don't want to give away too much more because it would reveal too much. That's not really what the book is about. That's on the surface what the book is about.
Yeah.
What would you tell people you discovered in the telling of this story that they need to hear today?
I think it was just if I'm asked the question, and it's always, as you know, the toughest question, what's your book about?
What is it about?
You stumble and you trip over, and and then finally you walk away, and then you go, oh, I should have said this.
Right.
But I think it's about a family, really, and it's about one moment that decimates that family, and one boy in the family that takes it upon himself to bring them all back together. And I don't think he realises he's doing that. He's really wanting to build a bridge to make something great and beautiful and perfect, to atone for what he feels are his sins. And what he doesn't know is that that's the way he's going to get his brothers and their father back together. But he's really just wanting to mould his life into this bridge, and it's made of stone, but it's made of him, it's made of clay. And that was what drew me to the story in the first place, was the idea that clay as a material can be moulded into anything, but it needs fire to set it. And once I had that idea for the book, I knew that it was something that I was going to try to get right for what looks like, a good portion of my own life.
A chunk of your adult life.
Yeah.
Originally, there was a girl narrator, Maggie. You discarded that and ended up with one of the brothers, Matthew being the narrator of the book, who is the narrator now. Why that change? What happened in the old telling that you didn't like?
Well, it just wasn't working. And I could recite the first 50 pages of that book without even thinking. I'd be walking down the street, mumbling her narration to myself, but it just never quite. I never felt quite comfortable with it. And I think when you're working so hard and you think, but it just didn't feel right. And then after 6 years, I had to make that dreaded decision. And you're always being tested as a writer, I think. You're always being tested with the question of how much do I want this? Right. How hungry am I to get this story written? And I think when you're faced with a dilemma like that, I tried everybody. I tried Matthew as the narrator. I tried every brother. I tried even their mother.
That's what I was going to ask you. Did you try the mother as a narrator?
I did, but then, not to give a spoiler, it said right at the beginning that there's this, one of the lines is their mother was dead, their father had fled.
Right.
And but then I thought, in my previous book, The Book Thief, I had death as the narrator.
Right.
And I thought if I have a dead character as the narrator, I thought, I don't want to just be the
Repeat
death guy
myself.
all the time. So, that's definitely sounding a bit grim. So it ended up being Matthew as Clay's brother when I just started believing it. And that's what made me want to be a writer in the first place, was you're reading something that someone has entirely made up, but when you're in it, you believe it. And when Matthew started telling the story about digging up an old typewriter in an old backyard of a town, I thought, now I'm feeling alive again. And I think you would recognise this too, that I'm just happiest when I'm writing and I'm writing well. And when you're getting those little sparks of ideas that say, this is when I'm at my best.
Well, you're telling yourself the story. There's an excitement as the story is coming to you. And so you can imagine, well, it's an experience you're passing along to the reader. But unless you're touched and excited, you can feel that in the narrative, if it's working or not. I mean, you really do.
Yeah, and so that's exactly how it felt. I mean, it's not that there aren't struggles then.
No.
I still got to a point in 2016 where my wife said to me, and she's really the unsung hero of this book, where she said to me, it was one of those great moments of tough love. She said, I'm giving you 1 week to get this book back on track at a point where you're actually happy with it again. And she said, other than that, you and Clay
have to
sort of
separate.
The character needs some, she said, I think you two need some time apart. And which is better than her saying that she and I need some time apart.
Right, exactly.
And so I worked for a week, nothing changed. And and I did quit the book for 6 weeks. She said the most dreaded thing that you could say to me. She said, why don't you work on your blog for a while? And the point is, no one in the world knows that I would even have a blog.
Knife
I'm
in the
not
heart.
good at that sort. I'm not good at that sort of stuff. And I tried to write a small side project. I thought, for that, I was sort of empty because I just said to myself at one point, God, before you were writing for the World Championship of yourself, when you were writing Bridge of Clay, and now you're doing this. And so I think sometimes the old cliche is true that we don't know what we've got until we lose it.
That's true.
And when I started again, I just went in with the idea that, it's a struggle to write a book, but it's actually a joyful struggle. And when I went in with that approach, I just started really loving it again. And 6 months later, I finished the book. And I also had been beating myself up for so long that it wasn't done, I was really, and then I realised how much work I'd actually done on the book. I just needed to finish it.
Right.
Just the last quarter to go.
Well, it is a complex book. You have chronologies, you have a lot of flashbacks and multiple character narratives. How did you keep track of all that? Or did that just come in the constant work over many years?
Well, I think every single thing in that book, whether people love it, don't love it, and it's all deliberate. Everything is there for a reason. Every word is there for a reason, and so when I'm willing to wear that if people say, I got confused here, but I've always said to myself that every time I write a book, I want it to be a better book than the last one, and or at least it's got to be a great attempt, and it's all in the attempt, and in this case, I've sort of said to people, there are different challenges in this book to my previous books, but I think the rewards are greater. And I know they have been for me in the writing of it. And I think as a writer, sometimes you have to just remember that.
Yeah.
You know, the next time you're beating yourself up about, it's a bit like, it's no different to surfing in some ways. Whenever I'm at home, I go for a surf, and I'm always thinking, why am I always the worst surfer out here? And that's how I feel about writing. I'm like, why am I always the worst writer here? And then you have to remind yourself, it's because I'm trying to do something. I'm always trying to write above myself. I'm trying to write better than I actually am. And that's the sort of writer I want to be, and I think it's the sort of person I want to be too.
The last book, The Book Thief, mined your parents' experiences in World War II. What was the root, the personal connection to this story, to Clay's story?
I think I was just always kind of ambitious as a kid, and I think that's because I'm the youngest of 4 siblings, and so I grew up with everybody saying, no, you can't play Monopoly, you're too young. No, you can't play cards, you're too young, which sounds almost petty, and maybe it is. But I was always a kid who, and this is really what it is. It wasn't so much a sense of one day I'm going to show everybody. It was more just what I love is stories, whether they're written or whether they're told to me. And so I was spoilt as the youngest of 4 kids, not by getting material things. I was spoilt by the fact that I got to spend the most meaningful amount of time, for the longest amount of time, with my mum and dad. And they told me their stories when I was a teenager, and I would ask for them over and over again. And so the root of this book, or the heart of this book, I think, is just how much I've always loved stories. And Clay is that sort of kid as well. He's the one who asks his mum and dad for the stories about, you know, when his dad did bury his dog and the snake who fought each other in his old backyard in that country town, and then how he buried his mum's typewriter in the backyard as well. And it's that very typewriter that Matthew goes out and digs up to write the story on. So I just love the idea that one story isn't just a story.
No.
It's the story that came before it and after it, between it and underneath it. And that's what this book is doing all the time.
Well, I loved a couple of things, and you've touched upon them. It's a sweeping family saga, really, of memory, of secrets and stories, and how the decisions of all those around us shape our own journey. We're not alone. And you know, this is such a powerful theme for me and in my work, because look, I have a middle grade series that contains a whole family. The kid doesn't go on the adventure alone. It's the complications of the family around him and the powers of that family that propel him or hold him back. And that's similar to what we find here, because this is life. And I loved that dimension of the work, that it's not afraid to go to those places, and it takes you to some of those unexpected. There's some memories you never want to see again or hear about, and yet they end up being the most important for not only the character but the reader in this case.
Yeah, there's a moment in the book that you may have come to where Penelope, Clay's mum, is actually telling him what he calls the unedited versions, because there's this idea that when we tell truths, we tell them as almost everything. There's always something we leave out. And towards the end of her life, she tells him the almost everythings. And then she says, you know, you've got to ask your dad. Tell him, please, you know, tell him about how you used to be able to draw and paint. And did you know he once buried a typewriter in his backyard? And she says, these stories aren't just stories, they're who we actually are. And that's why I'm a writer. That's why I love books, and that's why I'll always be writing. Whether you know, even if a ray of light came out of the sky and said, "You'll never write another book. You'll never be published. You'll never get anything for it," I would still be doing it, because it's what keeps me alive.
What are you working on now?
Absolutely nothing.
Aside from promoting Bridge of Clay.
I've come out the other side of this book, which has been a struggle at times, really loving writing more than I ever have. And so for that reason, I'm just going to write for a while and see what happens. But I've got a few different ideas, but I'm not sure which way I want to go with them yet. And there are a lot of characters in this book that could have been novels of their own, and whether I explore that, I'm not sure, but we'll just see how we go.
Markus, thank you so much. Bridge of Clay, available everywhere now. Fantastic read. Thanks for spending time with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a joy.
Such a pleasure.
That is all the time we have for now. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook, you can follow me on Twitter. The links are at raymondarroyo.com. Be sure to join us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.